My family mocked me for becoming a plumber instead of a doctor. Then their successful surgeon's son got caught selling opioid prescriptions. My mother cried when I told her I was enrolling in trade school instead of pre-med. She actually cried like I'd announced a terminal diagnosis. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands covering her face, while my father stood behind her with his arms crossed, looking at me like I'd just confessed to a crime. My brother Derek stood in the doorway to the living room wearing his Johns Hopkins sweatshirt, with this expression I'd seen before, the one that said he was embarrassed to be related to me. This was supposed to be dinner where I shared my college plans, but it turned into an intervention about my life choices. Dad asked if I understood what I was throwing away, as if turning down student loans for a medical degree I didn't want was somehow ruining a future that belonged to me. Mom kept saying she didn't raise me to fix toilets for a living. She used those exact words, fix toilets, like that was all plumbing involved, like the entire trade could be reduced to one crude task she found beneath our family's dignity. Derek had been accepted to Johns Hopkins pre-med on a full academic scholarship 2 years earlier. The day his acceptance letter arrived, Dad took him to the country club and bought him a Rolex. Mom threw a party and invited everyone from her book club and bridge group to celebrate. She had custom napkins printed that said, "Future Dr. Derek Brennan," with little stethoscopes around the border. She kept those napkins in a box in the china cabinet like they were historical documents. When Derek came home for holidays, she'd show them to guests and talk about how proud she was that her son was following in his grandfather's footsteps. Our grandfather had been a small-town general practitioner who died before I was born, but Mom talked about him like he was Albert Schweitzer. She'd built this mythology around medical service and family legacy that Derek fit perfectly, and I apparently destroyed by wanting to learn pipe fitting and drainage systems. I tried explaining that trade work was stable, that plumbers made decent money, that I'd actually enjoy working with my hands instead of memorizing organic chemistry. Dad cut me off mid-sentence and said I was making excuses for being lazy. He said medical school was hard and not everyone had the discipline for it, that it was okay if I wasn't smart enough, but I shouldn't pretend this was about preference. Those words landed like punches. Not smart enough. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather, while Mom nodded in agreement. Derek didn't say anything, just stood there in his expensive sweatshirt, looking at his phone. I remember thinking he could have defended me, could have said something, but he stayed silent because my failure made him look better by comparison. The trade school program started that fall, and I moved into a basement apartment across town that I could barely afford. Mom and Dad stopped calling. They didn't say they were cutting me off formally, they just stopped reaching out. When I called them, conversations lasted maybe 3 minutes before Mom found an excuse to hang up. She was always about to leave for something, a dentist appointment, or grocery shopping, or book club. Dad was somehow always busy with yard work or watching a game. They came to exactly 0 of my certification milestones. When I got my journeyman license, I texted a photo to the family group chat. Derek responded, "Cool," and my parents didn't respond at all. Meanwhile, Derek's medical school acceptance from Hopkins arrived with full funding, and suddenly my parents were alive again, posting constantly on social media about their brilliant son following his calling to heal people. I worked as an apprentice for a master plumber named Frank Kowalski, who'd been in the trade for 40 years. He was missing the tip of his left ring finger from an accident with a pipe cutter decades ago, and he had the kind of weathered face that comes from working in crawl spaces and attics through every season. Frank didn't care that I came from a family who thought trade work was beneath them. He cared that I showed up on time, paid attention, and didn't complain about the difficult jobs. He taught me everything about commercial and residential systems, about building codes and water pressure calculations, about how to spot problems before they became emergencies. He had this saying that a good plumber was worth more than a bad doctor because bad doctors bury their mistakes, but bad plumbers flood houses. I thought about that saying a lot during those early years when my family was pretending I didn't exist. The Thanksgiving after Derek started medical school, I made the mistake of going home for dinner. Mom had invited extended family, people I barely knew, cousins and aunts and uncles who lived scattered across 3 states. The dining room table was set with the good china Mom only used for special occasions, and there was a centerpiece made of fall leaves and small pumpkins that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Derek arrived late wearing designer clothes and looking exhausted in that performative way that suggested he wanted everyone to know how hard he was working. The moment he walked in, Mom rushed to hug him and started telling everyone how he was top of his anatomy class, how his professors said he had a gift for surgery. She kept using the word gift like he'd been touched by divine intervention. Dinner conversation revolved entirely around Derek's medical training, his clinical rotations, the impressive hospitals where he'd applied for residency. Someone finally asked what I was doing, some aunt whose name I couldn't remember. I said I was working as a plumber and had just gotten a commercial contract for a new office building downtown. The table went quiet for a moment, then Mom changed the subject by asking Derek about his research project, but my Uncle Gary, Dad's brother, didn't let it drop. He said at least someone in the family wasn't afraid of hard work, that trade jobs were honest work. Dad's face went red, and he said Gary didn't understand the difference between a career and a job. He emphasized those words like they were completely different species of employment. Gary started arguing back, saying he ran a successful construction company and made more than most doctors, that there was nothing wrong with working with your hands. Dad said that was different because Gary owned the company. He wasn't the one actually doing the labor, the implication being that ownership was dignified, but the actual work was beneath us. Derek stayed quiet during this argument, pushing food around his plate. I watched him refuse to defend me or acknowledge what I did had value. When dessert came, Mom served this elaborate cake she'd special ordered from an expensive bakery. It had "Congratulations, Dr. Brennan" written in icing, even though Derek was still in medical school and wouldn't be a doctor for years. She took photos from every angle and posted them online with captions about being blessed to have such an accomplished son. The singular son, like I'd been erased from the family tree through my choice of profession. I left before coffee was served and didn't go back for 3 years. They didn't call to ask why I stopped visiting. The silence from them felt louder than any argument we could have had. Frank offered me a junior partnership in his plumbing company 18 months after I got my journeyman license. He said I had instincts for problem solving that couldn't be taught, that I saw systems the way he did, understanding how everything connected. He was getting older and wanted to transition toward retirement, needed someone he trusted to take over the complex commercial jobs. The partnership meant I'd handle the business side too, bidding contracts, managing schedules, dealing with suppliers. I took out a loan for the partnership buy-in and worked 16-hour days to prove I deserved it. Within a year, we doubled our commercial contracts and hired 3 more apprentices. Frank started calling it our company instead of my company, and my name went on the truck doors, right next to his. I was 25 years old and part owner of a business that pulled in 6 figures annually. My parents never asked about any of it. Derek finished medical school near the top of his class and matched for a surgical residency at a prestigious hospital in the city, 3 hours from where we grew up. Mom and Dad drove up for his white coat ceremony and sent the family group chat probably 50 photos of him in his new doctor's coat. Mom's captions were breathless with pride, talking about how Derek had achieved everything he'd worked for, how their sacrifices had been worth it. The sacrifice comment stuck with me because they hadn't sacrificed anything. They hadn't paid for his education, scholarships and loans had covered it. They hadn't supported him emotionally any more than normal parents do. But Mom had constructed this narrative where they'd suffered nobly to produce this successful doctor son, and posting about it on social media gave her status among her friends. I was still in the family group chat, but never mentioned in any posts. I was the secret shame, the son who'd chosen wrong. The business continued growing, and Frank started talking seriously about full retirement. He wanted to sell me his remaining share of the company over 5 years through an installment plan that kept him comfortable, but gave me full ownership. We hired an attorney to draw up the paperwork, and I spent weeks going over financial projections and business plans. The numbers worked. I could afford the buyout and still expand the business into new markets. Frank had built something solid over 4 decades, and I was going to inherit it not because of family connections or legacy, but because I'd worked hard enough to earn his trust. The day we signed the papers, Frank took me out for dinner at this steakhouse he'd been going to since the 1980s. He said his biggest accomplishment wasn't building a successful business. It was finding someone worthy to continue it. I called my parents that night to tell them about becoming sole owner, that I'd built something real. Dad said that was nice, and asked if I'd heard Derek was doing groundbreaking work in reconstructive surgery. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Derek's residency program was brutal according to his social media posts, which Mom shared constantly. He worked 100-hour weeks, slept at the hospital, performed surgeries that pushed the boundaries of medical science. Mom's friends from book club would stop me in grocery stores to tell me how impressed they were with my brother, how it must be amazing to have such a talented sibling. They said it like they were complimenting me, like Derek's success was somehow mine through proximity. I'd nod and say something polite, while thinking about how they probably didn't even know what I did for a living. The town still saw me as the Brennan kid who disappointed his family by choosing the wrong career, while Derek was the golden child proving that hard work and intelligence led to greatness. Nobody mentioned that I'd taken a small plumbing company and turned it into a regional operation with 12 employees and contracts across 3 counties. The call from Mom came on a Wednesday morning while I was inspecting a commercial heating system. Her voice sounded strange, high-pitched and tight, like she was holding back tears. She said she needed to talk to me in person, that something had happened with Derek. My first thought was an accident. Maybe he'd gotten hurt at the hospital or been in a car crash driving home exhausted from a shift. She wouldn't tell me details over the phone, just kept insisting I needed to come to the house. I drove the 3 hours to their place with my mind running through scenarios, each worse than the last. When I arrived, both parents were sitting in the living room looking like someone had died. Dad's face was gray and Mom's eyes were swollen from crying. They sat me down, and Dad said Derek was in trouble, legal trouble. My brain couldn't process what that meant at first. Mom started talking fast, her words tumbling over each other. She said it was a misunderstanding, that Derek would never do what they were accusing him of, that someone at the hospital had made a mistake or was targeting him out of jealousy. Dad kept interrupting to say they needed to get Derek a good lawyer, that this would ruin his career if they didn't handle it right. I finally got them to slow down and explain what actually happened. The DEA had raided Derek's office at the hospital. They'd arrested him for illegally prescribing opioid pain medications. Mom insisted it was impossible, that Derek was a surgeon who helped people, who dedicated his life to healing. She said the DEA must have the wrong person or wrong information. Dad was already talking about attorneys they could hire, criminal defense specialists who handled medical cases. He mentioned numbers in the hundreds of thousands for legal fees. Neither of them had seen the actual charges yet, just gotten a call from Derek's chief resident saying he'd been arrested. I drove to Derek's apartment in the city that afternoon. He'd been released on bail and was sitting in his living room still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, expensive surgical scrubs and designer sneakers that probably cost $300. He looked smaller than I remembered, hunched over on his couch with his face in his hands. When he looked up at me, his eyes were red and his voice cracked when he said this was all wrong, that he'd been set up. I sat down across from him and asked him to tell me the truth, the actual truth, not the version Mom wanted to believe. He started talking, and it came out in pieces, defensive justifications mixed with admissions he didn't quite realize he was making. He said he'd been prescribing pain medications to patients who needed them, that some of them were people he knew socially who'd been injured and needed help. He made it sound like compassionate care, like he was being a good doctor who understood pain management. I asked him how many prescriptions he'd written outside of normal hospital channels. He said maybe 30 or 40 over the past year. I asked if he'd charged these people. He hesitated, then said some of them had paid him consultation fees in cash because they didn't want to go through insurance. The way he said it, trying to make it sound reasonable, made my stomach turn. I asked him how much these consultation fees were. He wouldn't look at me when he said it varied, maybe 500 to 1,000 per prescription depending on the medication strength. I did the math in my head. 30 prescriptions at even 500 each was $15,000 in cash. That wasn't compassionate care, that was dealing drugs with a medical license as cover. I asked him directly if he understood what he'd done. He got angry then, said I wouldn't understand because I wasn't in medicine, didn't know the pressure he was under or how patients manipulated doctors for medications. The court documents arrived at my parents' house 3 days later. Mom called me crying, saying I needed to come read them, that they made Derek sound like a monster. I drove back and sat at their kitchen table reading through the federal charges. The DEA hadn't made a mistake. They'd been investigating Derek for 8 months after multiple pharmacies flagged unusual prescription patterns. He'd written over 200 prescriptions for oxycodone, hydrocodone, and fentanyl patches to people who weren't his patients at the hospital. Some of these people had traveled from different states to see him. The DEA had documentation of cash payments totaling over $100,000. They had recorded phone calls where Derek discussed prices for different medications and strengths. They had text messages arranging meetings in parking lots and hotel rooms. This wasn't a few compassionate exceptions. This was a systematic operation selling prescription opioids for cash. The documents included patient statements. One woman said she'd been buying pills from Derek for a year, that her previous doctor had cut her off, and Derek had been her only source. She'd overdosed twice during that year. A man said Derek had given him prescriptions for amounts far beyond what any legitimate doctor would prescribe, that he'd been selling half the pills to pay for the prescriptions and using the rest himself. He'd lost his job and his family during his addiction. Another patient had died of an overdose with pills prescribed by Derek in his system. The family had sued the hospital, not knowing at first that Derek had prescribed outside official channels. The DEA report estimated Derek had contributed to at least 15 overdoses, 3 of them fatal, through his illegal prescribing. These weren't people he'd helped. These were people he'd profited from while they destroyed their lives. Mom kept insisting there had to be explanations for everything, that the DEA was twisting facts to make Derek look guilty. She said he was being targeted because successful doctors made easy targets for federal agencies looking to boost their statistics. Dad was already meeting with criminal defense attorneys, spending their retirement savings on consultations with specialists who handled medical fraud cases. They'd mortgaged the house to pay the retainer for a former federal prosecutor who claimed he could get the charges reduced. The attorney's initial opinion was that Derek was looking at 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. The Controlled Substances Act carried mandatory minimum sentences for distribution, and prescribing opioids for profit counted as distribution. The medical board had already suspended Derek's license pending the outcome of the criminal trial. He couldn't practice medicine, couldn't work at the hospital, couldn't do anything with the career he'd spent 8 years training for. I went to see Derek at his apartment again after reading the court documents. This time, I brought the papers with me and dropped them on his coffee table. I asked him to explain the recorded phone calls about prices, the text messages arranging parking lot meetings, the $100,000 in cash payments. He tried the same defensive posture at first, saying the DEA had taken things out of context, that he'd been trying to help people in chronic pain who were being denied care by their regular doctors. I cut him off and asked about the woman who'd overdosed twice, or the man who died with Derek's pills in his system. His face went pale, and he said he hadn't known about that he couldn't control what patients did with their medications. I told him that was exactly the problem, that he wasn't treating patients. He was selling drugs to addicts and pretending it was medical care. He started crying then, not the performative tears from earlier, but real sobbing that shook his shoulders. He finally admitted he'd gotten into debt during residency, that the salary wasn't enough to cover his student loans and the lifestyle he'd been maintaining. He'd bought an expensive car, rented a luxury apartment, wore designer clothes because that was what successful surgeons did. He'd started writing a few prescriptions for friends who asked, charging small fees to help with expenses. Then those friends told other people, and suddenly he had patients willing to pay cash for pills without the hassle of regular appointments or insurance paperwork. The money had been too easy. $500 cash for writing a prescription that took 30 seconds. He'd told himself it was harmless, that these people would get the medication somehow anyway, might as well be from a real doctor who could ensure they were safe. But he'd never followed up with patients, never monitored their use, never questioned when they came back too soon for refills. He'd just taken the cash and written more prescriptions. The newspaper coverage started the next week. Local reporters got hold of the story about a prestigious surgeon caught running an illegal pill mill. The articles used phrases like opioid epidemic and medical professional abuse and prescription drug trafficking. They published Derek's photo, his medical school graduation picture where he looked young and idealistic in his white coat. They interviewed addiction specialists who talked about how doctors who dealt drugs betrayed the fundamental trust of their profession. They quoted DEA statistics about prescription opioid deaths and how doctors had fueled the crisis through overprescribing and illegal distribution. One article mentioned the patients who'd overdosed and died, including a 32-year-old mother of 3 who'd gotten pills from Derek 2 days before she was found dead in her bathroom. The article included quotes from her family calling for maximum prosecution. Mom stopped leaving the house. She couldn't go to her book club or bridge group without facing questions and judgment from women who'd previously celebrated Derek's success. Dad stopped going to the country club because other members were talking about it. The same people who'd congratulated them on having a doctor son now whispered about them having a drug dealer son. My parents' social standing, the thing they'd valued above everything else, was destroyed by Derek's choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd been so proud of Derek's prestigious career, so dismissive of my blue-collar work, and now his prestige had turned to scandal, while I still had a business and reputation built on honest work. But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt disgusted watching my brother throw away everything for money he didn't even need. The preliminary hearing happened 6 weeks after the arrest. I sat in the back of the courtroom while federal prosecutors presented evidence to a judge. They showed documentation of over 200 illegal prescriptions written over 18 months. They played recordings of phone calls where Derek discussed prices and quantities like he was negotiating business deals. They presented bank records showing cash deposits that didn't match his hospital salary. Derek's expensive attorney tried arguing that he'd been providing legitimate medical care to people in pain, that the government was criminalizing standard medical practice. The judge looked skeptical. She pointed out that Derek had written prescriptions to people he'd never examined in person, had no medical files for, and who lived in different states. She said this wasn't a boundary dispute about medical practice, it was clearly illegal drug distribution using a medical license as cover. The prosecutor was a woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years handling drug cases. She gave a statement about how medical professionals who dealt drugs were particularly dangerous because patients trusted them, believed they were getting safe care when actually they were being exploited. She said Derek's actions had directly contributed to the opioid crisis that killed thousands of Americans every year. She said he'd taken an oath to first do no harm, and instead had harmed dozens of people for profit. She asked the judge to deny bail reduction and keep Derek under house arrest pending trial. The judge agreed. Derek would stay confined to his apartment with an ankle monitor, unable to work or leave except for legal meetings. My parents sat in the front row looking destroyed. Mom was crying quietly, and Dad had his arm around her, but his face was empty, like something fundamental had broken inside him. I started getting calls from extended family members who'd heard about the case. Uncle Gary called to say he felt terrible about how things had turned out, that he'd always liked Derek despite the family's pretension. He asked how I was doing, if I needed anything. It was strange being on the receiving end of sympathy when I wasn't the one in trouble. My cousin Rachel called and said she'd seen the news coverage, that she was shocked because Derek had always seemed so dedicated to medicine. She mentioned in passing that she'd heard through the family grapevine that I'd done well with my plumbing business, that she was happy for me. These conversations felt awkward because people didn't know whether to treat me like a victim or a success story. I was the brother of an accused drug dealer, but also someone who'd built something legitimate. The contrast seemed to make people uncomfortable. The trial date was set for 8 months out. Derek's attorney filed dozens of motions trying to suppress evidence, claiming illegal searches and improper DEA procedures. All the motions were denied. The evidence was overwhelming and properly obtained through warrants based on legitimate pharmacy reports. Derek's medical license suspension became permanent when the medical board completed their investigation. They found he'd violated every standard of medical ethics and determined he was unfit to ever practice medicine again. This was separate from the criminal case. Even if somehow he avoided prison, he'd never work as a doctor. 8 years of education and training gone. Mom called me crying after the medical board ruling, saying this was killing her, watching her son's life fall apart. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part couldn't forget how she'd treated me when I made a career choice she disapproved of. Dad called 2 weeks later asking if we could meet. He drove to my city, and we had coffee at a diner near my office. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few months. His hair had gone completely gray, and he'd lost weight in an unhealthy way that made his face look gaunt. He started by apologizing for how they'd treated me, saying they'd been wrong to value Derek's career over my choices. He said watching Derek's scandal had made him reevaluate what actually mattered. He asked about my business and seemed genuinely interested when I told him about recent contracts and expansion plans. He said he was proud of what I'd built. Those words sounded hollow, coming years too late, but I could see he meant them now even if he hadn't before. Then he said they needed help with Derek's legal fees. The attorney was charging $40,000 a month, and they'd burned through their savings. They'd mortgaged the house, but that money was running out. I felt my chest tighten when he asked for money. This was the moment I'd imagined in bitter fantasies over the years. My family finally needing something from me after treating me like I was worthless. I could have said no immediately, could have thrown their past behavior in Dad's face. Instead, I asked him to send me the attorney's bills and give me time to think about it. Dad looked relieved, like he'd expected me to refuse on the spot. He thanked me and said he knew he didn't deserve my help after everything. We finished coffee in awkward silence, and he left. I sat there for another hour, thinking about what Derek had done, about the people who died from pills he prescribed, about whether he deserved expensive legal defense at all. I thought about the mother of 3 who'd overdosed and what her family felt watching the news about Derek's trial. I thought about whether helping pay for his defense made me complicit in minimizing what he'd done. I called the DEA office the next day and asked to speak to the lead investigator on Derek's case. A man named Special Agent Coleman called me back within an hour. I explained I was Derek's brother and wanted to understand the case better before deciding whether to help with legal fees. Coleman was surprisingly willing to talk. He said the investigation had started after a pharmacist in Virginia noticed Derek's name on multiple prescriptions filled by the same patient within days. The pharmacist had reported it, and the DEA started tracking Derek's prescribing patterns. They'd found he was writing prescriptions at triple the rate of other surgeons, many to people who lived hundreds of miles from his hospital. They'd interviewed patients, and many admitted they were paying cash directly to Derek for pills. Some said they were addicts who couldn't get prescriptions from their regular doctors anymore. Some said they were selling the pills Derek prescribed. One man said he'd been buying oxycodone from Derek and reselling it to support his own fentanyl addiction. Coleman said the worst part wasn't even the illegal prescribing. It was that Derek had known what he was doing was causing harm and continued anyway. They had text messages where patients told Derek they were struggling with addiction and asked for help. Derek's responses were prescriptions for more pills. They had voicemails from family members begging Derek to stop prescribing to their loved ones. Derek had blocked their numbers. Coleman said cases like this made him sick because doctors were supposed to help people, and Derek had weaponized his medical knowledge and authority to exploit vulnerable addicts for money. He said the prosecutors were pushing for maximum sentencing because they wanted to send a message that medical professionals who dealt drugs would face serious consequences. I thanked him and hung up feeling nauseous. I spent 3 days going through every detail I could find about Derek's case. Court documents were public record, and I read all of them. The evidence was damning beyond anything I'd imagined. Derek hadn't just made bad choices or gotten in over his head. He'd knowingly sold prescription drugs to addicts, ignored warning signs of overdoses, and continued operating his pill mill even after patients died. There were text messages where he joked about customers being desperate, where he negotiated higher prices when patients begged for pills. There were recordings where he told patients exactly how to answer pharmacy questions to avoid suspicion. He'd taught them to lie about their pain levels and medical history. He'd coached them on faking symptoms. This wasn't a doctor making mistakes. This was a criminal using medical credentials to run a drug-dealing operation. The most disturbing evidence was a ledger Derek had kept tracking his cash payments. He documented every transaction like a business, noting patient names, medications prescribed, amounts charged, dates. The ledger showed he'd made over $250,000 in cash over 18 months. He'd deposited some of it in offshore accounts, trying to hide the money from taxes. The IRS had joined the investigation for tax evasion on unreported income. Derek was facing not just drug charges, but financial crimes too. Each count carried years of prison time. His expensive attorney was fighting hard, but everyone involved knew the outcome was inevitable. The evidence was too strong and too documented. Derek would go to prison. The only question was for how long. I called Dad back and told him I wasn't helping with legal fees. He started to argue, saying family had to stick together in crisis. I cut him off and said I'd read the entire case file. I told him about the ledger, the text messages joking about desperate customers, the voicemails from families begging Derek to stop. I told him about the mother of 3 who died and how Derek had kept prescribing to other patients afterward. Dad went quiet. I said Derek didn't deserve expensive legal defense minimizing what he'd done. He deserved whatever the justice system decided. Dad's voice was barely a whisper when he said they'd hoped I'd be different from Derek, that I'd show compassion. I said compassion was what Derek should have shown his patients, instead of treating them like profit centers. I said enabling Derek's defense was enabling the idea that doctors could deal drugs without serious consequences. The call ended, and Dad didn't contact me again. The trial started in federal court 8 months after Derek's arrest. I didn't plan to attend, but something pulled me there anyway. Maybe I needed to see justice happen, to watch the brother who'd been held up as the perfect son face real consequences. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of overdose victims, and medical professionals watching to see how the system would handle a doctor who'd betrayed his oath. Derek sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking smaller than he had in his surgical scrubs. His attorney was a silver-haired man in his 60s who'd successfully defended white-collar criminals before. The federal prosecutor was the same woman from the preliminary hearing, and she looked determined. The opening statements laid out 2 completely different narratives. Derek's attorney portrayed him as a dedicated surgeon who'd made mistakes under pressure, who'd tried to help patients in pain and been punished for compassion. The prosecutor portrayed him as a drug dealer who'd exploited his medical license to profit from addiction and suffering. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution brought witness after witness, pharmacists who'd flagged Derek's prescriptions, DEA agents who'd investigated him, patients who admitted buying pills illegally and described how Derek had operated. One woman testified that Derek had prescribed her enough oxycodone for a small army, that she'd been taking 10 pills a day and still had bottles left over. She'd been in active addiction, and Derek had never once suggested treatment or asked about her pain management plan. He'd just taken her cash and written prescriptions. Another witness was the widower of the woman who died. He testified through tears about finding his wife unresponsive, about the pill bottles with Derek's name on the label, about their 3 children asking why mommy wasn't coming home. The jury looked horrified. Several family members of overdose victims testified about loved ones who'd gotten prescriptions from Derek and subsequently died. The defense tried arguing that Derek couldn't control what patients did with legitimately prescribed medications. The prosecutor destroyed that argument by showing Derek's own text messages where he'd discussed selling pills, where he'd arranged meetings outside normal medical settings, where he'd negotiated prices based on medication strength and quantity. She showed bank records of cash deposits that matched the dates of illegal prescriptions. She showed the ledger where Derek had tracked his drug-dealing income like a business. She brought expert witnesses who testified that no legitimate medical practice looked anything like what Derek had been doing. A pain management specialist testified that Derek's prescribing patterns matched drug dealers, not doctors. He said the amounts prescribed, the lack of patient examinations, the cash-only payment structure, the coaching of patients to lie, all indicated knowing illegal distribution. Derek took the stand in his own defense, which his attorney had advised against, but Derek insisted on. He cried while testifying about the pressure of residency, about student loan debt, about wanting to help people in pain. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. She walked him through specific prescriptions, asking him to explain medical justifications for each one. Derek couldn't provide legitimate reasons. She asked him to explain text messages where he'd joked about customers. He said he'd been stressed and those messages didn't reflect his real feelings. She asked him why he'd never reported concerns about patient addiction to other medical professionals. He had no answer. She asked him directly if he understood that his prescriptions had contributed to overdoses and deaths. He said he hadn't intended for anyone to get hurt. She asked if that mattered to the families of dead patients. He broke down crying on the stand and couldn't continue. The judge called a recess, and Derek was led out by his attorney. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I sat in the courtroom waiting for the verdict along with dozens of other people invested in the outcome. Mom and Dad were there looking destroyed. Mom had barely spoken during the trial, just sat crying quietly every day. Dad had aged another 5 years in 3 weeks. When the jury came back, the forewoman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts: drug distribution, illegal prescribing, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, money laundering, tax evasion. The judge set sentencing for 60 days later. Derek sat motionless as the verdict was read. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder, but Derek didn't react. Mom collapsed, sobbing in Dad's arms. Other family members of victims cheered quietly. I sat there feeling empty, watching my brother's life end in real time. This was justice, but it didn't feel satisfying. It felt inevitable and sad and wasteful. Sentencing day came in early autumn. The courtroom was packed again with people wanting to see what punishment Derek would receive. The prosecution recommended 30 years in federal prison, citing the severity of his crimes and the need to send a message to other medical professionals. Derek's attorney argued for minimum sentencing, emphasizing Derek's lack of prior criminal history and his cooperation with investigators. Several family members of overdose victims gave impact statements. The widower of the woman who died described how his children had nightmares and struggled in school without their mother. A father described his son's descent into addiction and eventual death from an overdose involving pills Derek prescribed. An elderly couple described their daughter's addiction and how Derek had enabled it by providing prescriptions no legitimate doctor would write. Each statement was devastating, and Derek kept his head down through all of them. The judge was a woman in her 70s who'd been on the federal bench for 30 years. She'd presided over hundreds of drug cases, and her reputation was tough but fair. When she spoke, the courtroom went silent. She said Derek's case represented a particularly egregious betrayal of public trust because doctors held positions of authority and responsibility. She said patients trusted doctors with their lives, and Derek had exploited that trust for profit. She said his actions had directly contributed to the opioid crisis that had devastated communities across the country. She said the evidence showed he'd known exactly what he was doing and had continued anyway, even as patients died. She said she'd considered the guidelines and the arguments from both sides. Then she sentenced Derek to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. The courtroom erupted with reactions. Family members of victims cried with relief. Derek's attorney objected, but the judge was done. Derek was led away in handcuffs while Mom screamed his name. I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine that felt wrong for the day's darkness. Mom and Dad were surrounded by reporters asking how they felt about the sentence. Dad said no comment and pushed through the crowd. Mom was crying too hard to speak. I made it to my truck and sat there for a while before starting the engine. 25 years meant Derek would be in his 50s when he got out, if he survived prison at all. His medical career was over. His life as he'd known it was over. But the families who'd lost people to overdoses didn't get their loved ones back. The woman's 3 children would grow up without a mother because Derek had wanted easy money. The math of justice didn't balance those scales, but it was the only justice we had. I drove home thinking about how my parents had valued Derek's prestigious career above everything, had mocked my choice to be a plumber, and now their doctor son was a convicted felon, while their plumber son had built something honest and lasting. The news coverage continued for weeks. National outlets picked up the story as an example of the opioid crisis and medical professional complicity. Derek's case was cited in congressional hearings about prescription drug abuse. Medical schools used it as a case study about ethics violations. The hospital where Derek had worked conducted internal investigations and fired several administrators who'd missed warning signs. New protocols were implemented for monitoring physician prescribing patterns. Derek's case became bigger than just him, a symbol of systemic failures that had enabled the opioid epidemic. His name became shorthand for medical professionals who betrayed their oaths. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek had achieved a kind of fame my parents never imagined, just not the kind they'd dreamed about when he'd gotten into Johns Hopkins. Mom had a breakdown 3 weeks after the sentencing, Dad found her in Derek's childhood bedroom, surrounded by his medical school diplomas and old photos. She'd stopped eating and sleeping, couldn't accept that her perfect son was in federal prison. Dad admitted her to a psychiatric facility for treatment. He called me from the hospital parking lot sounding broken. He said he didn't know how to fix any of this, that everything they'd built their lives around had been revealed as empty. He said he'd been wrong about what mattered, wrong about pushing Derek towards success without considering who he was becoming, wrong about dismissing my choices. He said he was sorry, and the word came out like a confession. I told him I forgave him, but that forgiveness didn't erase the years of mockery and dismissal. He said he knew and hung up. I visited Mom at the psychiatric facility once she'd stabilized enough for visitors. She looked fragile, sitting in the common room wearing sweatpants instead of her usual coordinated outfits. She apologized for how she'd treated me, for caring more about status than character, for missing my actual accomplishments while celebrating Derek's credentials. She said she'd been living in delusion for years, believing that prestigious careers and social standing meant her children were good people. She said she hadn't raised Derek to be a drug dealer and couldn't understand where they'd gone wrong. I told her they'd raised him to value success and status above everything else, to believe his career made him special, to think his medical degree meant rules didn't apply to him. She cried and said I was right. We talked for an hour about everything that had happened, and when I left, she thanked me for coming despite having every reason not to. Derek sent a letter from prison 6 months into his sentence. It arrived at my office in a plain envelope with a federal prison return address. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won. The letter was 3 pages of small handwriting. He started by saying he knew I probably hated him and wouldn't want to hear from him. He said he'd had a lot of time to think about his choices and what had led him to destroy his life. He said he'd become addicted to the status and money, had started believing he was special because of his medical degree. He said the family's obsession with his success had fed into his sense of entitlement. He said he'd thought being a doctor made him smarter and better than people struggling with addiction. He'd seen patients as customers instead of people. He'd prioritized profit over care. He said he understood now that he'd caused real harm to real people, and no amount of apology could fix that. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but wanted me to know he was genuinely sorry for everything. The letter continued with Derek talking about prison and how different his life had become. He worked in the prison library and was taking classes on addiction counseling. He said he wanted to understand the disease he'd profited from, wanted to find some way to make amends, even though he knew nothing could balance what he'd done. He said he thought about the families who'd lost people every day. He said he'd written letters to them apologizing, but his attorney advised him not to send them because they could be used against him in civil lawsuits. He said that made him feel worse, knowing that even his apologies were constrained by legal strategy. He said he'd been a coward and a monster and deserved to be in prison. The letter ended with him saying he hoped I was doing well with my business, that he'd always actually admired my independence even though he'd never said it. He signed it, "Your brother," and I sat there staring at those words for a long time. I didn't respond to Derek's letter immediately. I carried it around for weeks trying to decide if his remorse was genuine or just prison perspective. Eventually, I wrote back a single page. I told him I appreciated the apology, but that it didn't change what he'd done. I told him about the families who'd testified at his trial, about the widower and the children without a mother. I told him that understanding addiction now didn't erase the harm he'd caused when he was exploiting it for profit. I told him I hoped he found a way to live with his choices, but that I wasn't interested in rebuilding our relationship. I said I'd forgiven him for my own peace of mind, but forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. I mailed the letter and tried to put Derek out of my mind. The business continued to grow. Frank fully retired to Florida, and I bought him out on schedule. We now handled commercial projects across the region, employed 18 people, and had a reputation for quality work and ethical business practices. I married my girlfriend from college who'd stuck with me through everything, and we bought a house in the suburbs. Life moved forward while Derek stayed frozen in a federal prison cell. Mom stabilized and moved into a smaller house after divorcing Dad. He'd refused to acknowledge his role in Derek's choices, still making excuses and blaming outside factors. Mom said she couldn't spend the rest of her life pretending their family dynamics hadn't contributed to the disaster. She started volunteering at an addiction recovery center, trying to help people affected by the opioid crisis her son had contributed to. She said it didn't make up for anything, but it felt like the only meaningful thing she could do. 5 years after Derek's sentencing, I got contacted by a documentary filmmaker making a film about the opioid epidemic. She wanted to interview me about Derek's case and our family dynamics. I agreed after thinking about it for a week. The interview lasted 3 hours, and I told her everything. About the mockery for choosing plumbing, about Derek's golden child status, about how our parents had valued prestige over character, about discovering what Derek had done and deciding not to help with legal fees, about watching the trial and sentencing, about how the whole experience had taught me that real success wasn't about credentials or status, but about building something honest that helped people. The filmmaker said my perspective was important because it showed how family dynamics and values could create environments where people felt entitled to break rules. The documentary aired on a major streaming platform and got significant attention. My interview was a small part of it, but several news outlets picked up on the angle about family pressure and prestige worship contributing to professional malfeasance. I did a few follow-up interviews where I talked about how trade work had saved me from the toxic path Derek had followed, about how choosing honest work over prestigious credentials had been the best decision I ever made, even though my family had mocked me for it, about how I'd built a successful business and a good life without needing validation from people who'd valued the wrong things. The interviews led to speaking invitations at trade schools and business groups. I started talking about my experience as a lesson in following your own path, regardless of others' expectations. Mom came to one of my speaking events at a trade school graduation. She sat in the audience crying while I talked about choosing plumbing over pre-med and how that choice had led to everything good in my life. Afterward, she hugged me and said she was proud of who I'd become despite her failure to support it when it mattered. She said watching me build something real while Derek's prestige had turned to ashes had taught her that she'd valued all the wrong things as a parent. We'd rebuilt something of a relationship over the years, limited but genuine. She was the only family member I maintained contact with. Dad had remarried and moved to Arizona, still making excuses for Derek and blaming the system for his son's conviction. I hadn't spoken to him in 3 years. Derek reached the 10-year mark of his sentence and became eligible for parole consideration. His attorney filed the paperwork and Derek went before the parole board. They denied his release, citing the severity of his crimes and the number of victims. He'd be eligible again in 5 years. Mom visited him monthly in prison and said he'd genuinely changed, that he worked with addiction counselors and led support groups for other inmates struggling with substance abuse. She said he'd become the person he should have been all along, someone who actually helped people instead of exploiting them. I didn't visit Derek in prison. Maybe that made me cold, but I couldn't forget the families who'd lost people because of his choices. His redemption arc didn't erase their permanent losses. My business celebrated its 15th anniversary with a company party for employees and their families. We'd grown to 25 employees, and annual revenue in the millions. We'd maintained our reputation for quality work and ethical practices. Several of my original apprentices had become master plumbers and junior partners. Frank flew up from Florida for the party and gave a speech about how proud he was that I'd taken his company and built it into something bigger while staying true to its core values. My wife was pregnant with our second child, and my mom was there celebrating with us. I looked around at what I'd built, the family I'd created, the life I'd chosen despite mockery and pressure. None of it would have happened if I'd followed the path my parents wanted. I'd failed their test by becoming a plumber instead of a doctor, but I'd passed the only test that actually mattered by building something honest and real that helped people without causing harm. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.